Okay, welcome everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. We'll probably have some folks joining us in the next few minutes as we get started here, but we did want to go ahead and get underway in the interest of time. But again, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for another installment of the Research webinar series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. For those of you who don't know, the goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of MVU, or the Michigan Virtual University, which is a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU is also the parent company of Michigan Virtual School, a supplemental state-sponsored virtual school, Michigan LearnPort, an online professional development portal for K-12 educators and personnel, and MyBlend, a blended learning initiative providing K-12 schools with resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students and improve student achievement. Before we introduce today's presenters, we just have a quick disclaimer. The topic of the presentation today is, again, measuring blended learning. We just wanted to mention that this webinar will be recorded publicly and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during this webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and/or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, and are not given nor endorsed by MVU/MVLRI unless otherwise specified. So allow me to go ahead and introduce our presenter for today. Saro Mohammed is a partner at the Learning Accelerator, where her work focuses on understanding if, how, and when blended learning is effective in K-12 settings nationally. She has a decade of experience in education research and external evaluations of programs implemented in public, private, and nonprofit settings. Prior to joining the Learning Accelerator, Saro was the inaugural assistant director of 2 research units in the College of Education at the University of Texas at Austin. Since 2008, she has worked directly with more than 20 school districts, either in a research or program evaluation context, and one-on-one with more than 10 states in a technical assistance/capacity building role. In addition, Saro serves as a reviewer for and advisor to federally funded research centers, including the Institute of Education Sciences, the Center on Online Learning and Students with Disabilities, and the Rapid Cycle Technology Evaluation Initiative. Saro holds a PhD in educational psychology from the University of Texas at Austin and a Bachelor of Science in Brain and Cognitive Sciences from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She volunteers at the United Way for Greater Austin, serving on their Target Graduation Strategic Advisory Council and their Research Working Group. We are incredibly honored to have Saro present for us today. With that, I will hand it over to her.
Thank you, Justin. Feel free to jump in and let me know if there's any issues with the audio. And also feel free to ask questions during the presentation. We have a lot of slides to get through, and there is some time at the end for questions, but if questions do come up during, I'm happy to take them then as well. Today, we're going to spend some time very quickly figuring out who is here with us, and then jumping into what are the objectives for today's webinar. And finally, the meat of the presentation will actually be about our measurement agenda at TLA that's focused on measuring blended learning. So we will go through the need for an agenda, where we are right now with current conditions, what is the challenge, and then talk a little bit more about the agenda itself, which is a resource that will be posted on our website in the next few days. So today we will not be sharing the slides from today's webinar because a lot of the content is actually going to be included in that online resource that everyone will have access to. We'll go through the organization of the resource and then objectives for learning, dissemination, competencies, and then finally implementation of evidence-based practices within blended learning models. So now that you know a little bit about me, I would like to find out some more about you. So there should be a poll that's popping up soon on your screen, and please use the poll just to indicate which of these buckets or roles sort of best describes who you are or the perspective that you bring to today's webinar. There should be, there it is at the middle of your screen. Go ahead and select. And if you do select other and would like to expand on who you might be, feel free to use the chat box to do that. I know a lot of you have already indicated who you are and where you're from. Okay, so we have a lot of researchers, a couple developers or vendors or entrepreneurs representing maybe industry. Much fewer educators and administrators that I would have liked, but not everyone is on spring break right now, although we are here in Texas. And then I'm not seeing any funders. So great, that's going to help me figure out which of these slides we need to dive deep into and which ones we can just skim through. Although there will be content for all of these groups in the actual resource that is posted. I'm going to go ahead and end our poll. So today, what I would really like for all of us to take away is, by the end of this session, to have an idea of what is the current state of evidence of blended learning effectiveness, and this is across the sector. So if you think of everywhere in the ecosystem, what do we know about the effectiveness of blended? I'd also like you to leave with an idea of how your own role fits into an overall measurement roadmap, although for such a research-heavy group, I'm not sure that there are lots of questions that I can answer about this piece, and then how you can contribute to understanding effectiveness through your own work. The resource that I have linked there is also linked from our homepage, learningaccelerator.org. And it's really your portal into understanding all of the recommendations and resources that the Learning Accelerator has produced for school districts. Within that link, you will find a tab that goes to our measurement resources, and that's where you will find the measurement agenda as soon as it's posted. So you guys are lucky we're all getting a sort of a sneak peek into the measurement agenda today. So what is the need for an agenda? So in education and in many social science sectors, public health and others, economy, the implementation of evidence-based practice actually requires the coordinated action of several different stakeholders. When we talk about blended, we being TLA or the Learning Accelerator, we specifically are thinking about the strategic integration of in-person learning with technology to enable three things: real-time data use instructionally, personalized instruction, and competency-based progression. And so whenever you see blended learning on our site or throughout this presentation, that's really the vision for blended that we are focused on. So we are not solely focused on educational technology. We are actually much more focused on the teaching and learning that is happening in classrooms, the pedagogical or instructional practices, and how those can facilitate using data in real time, personalizing instruction, or enabling mastery or competency-based progression. And we believe that technology is a facilitator or an enabler to scale or sustain those instructional practices, but we don't think that blended learning is solely about technology. So if we want to uncover the evidence base that, you know, those practices that supports or doesn't support those practices being advantageous to students, we actually have to use a breadth of knowledge and skills that traditionally we have associated with different roles and responsibilities. So researchers have very specific roles and responsibilities that they can use to help uncover the evidence base, but researchers really often are not in a position to get those evidence-based practices implemented or to ensure that they are successfully deployed in classrooms, right? So we need different skills across these different stakeholder groups. The evidence base right now is still very young, and a large part of it is very theoretical. And so if we want to get to a point where we all have a shared, deeper understanding of effectiveness, then we all kind of have to work together. We all hold, if you will, different pieces of the puzzle that represents what is effective practice in blended environments. And of course, doing what's best for students is really, all it really requires is typical good research and measurement practices, but it requires these to be applied in classrooms as well. So I feel like I'm preaching to the choir at this point, but there is sort of a case to be made for why, right? Why do we need to know about and implement evidence-based practices? Well, basically, if we have evidence about particular practices, then knowing this evidence and implementing these practices really reduces our risk of not meeting every single student's instructional needs. So you can think of it as sort of a risk reduction proposition in a classroom. If we know and we implement evidence-based practices, then we have the highest chance of doing the best we can for all of our students, regardless of their needs. And just to drive that point home, the new legislation, ESSA, or the Every Student Succeeds Act, which has replaced No Child Left Behind, but is basically the new instantiation of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It does acknowledge the importance of evidence-based practices. It actually uses the phrase evidence-based 62 times throughout the law, and they define it on page 289 if you want to go and take a look. So I do see a question in here that I'm going to tackle right now. What is TLA's definition of personalized instruction? So we do not at TLA quibble about the differences between individualized, personalized, and differentiated instruction. There are definitions that are out there, and there are people who acknowledge the differences between these three terms or don't use them interchangeably. We believe that as long as instruction is targeted to the individual needs of students as much as possible, then instruction is being personalized. So basically, if you take a Vygotskian view, if modeling scaffolding is happening right within each student's zone of proximal development, then that's sort of our very broad definition of personalization. So I'm moving to the current conditions now, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we already know. I'm going to use this chart as a framework, and so I wanted to put it up here so that you can you can orient yourself. The y-axis contains different elements of blended learning that we believe that we need to know about, and the x-axis is going to include the level of evidence. And so just to give you a sense of how we think about it, right now we have different levels of understanding about, I'm reading the comments. You guys are funny. We have different levels of understanding about different elements of blended learning. And so the core elements are going to be taken from TLA's vision, but it's also going to include some other characteristics about implementation that we believe we need to understand if we're going to really understand effectiveness. And then the horizontal axis has summarized or parsed out different levels of evidence into a range of causal rigor. So beginning with examples and sort of more descriptive studies, moving to comparisons, which do include correlations, and then finally coming to much more causal designs like validations, and then finally syntheses or meta-analyses. Again, I feel like with such a heavy research audience, this is sort of Research 101 for some of you guys, but different study designs are going to be able to uncover different levels of evidence. So in examples, you're probably thinking about something like a case study or, like I said, a descriptive study. In syntheses or meta-analyses, you're actually combining multiple studies together. And different study designs also support different strengths of claims. So if you have done a case study and you have lots of examples, you're not going to be able to talk about causal effectiveness. But if you do have a meta-analysis that are based on strong causal randomized controlled trials, then you are going to be able to say or to make claims about effectiveness. To delve a little bit deeper into the examples that I just gave, so an example of a claim that can be supported by an example or a descriptive study is something like our implementation occurred at the same times as our outcomes. it may be that your example or your case study actually doesn't look at or describe outcomes at all. Or it may be that you just had a single group, you didn't do any statistical analyses, but you are reporting percentages, trends, even means. These are all considered descriptive type studies. If you have a comparison study, you usually have more than one group, so you are able to compare your group to another, or you might have different outcomes that you're comparing. In the case of correlational study, you may have just one group, but you are looking at two sets of variables. And you will be able to make a claim such as our implementation appears to be related to outcomes, or our data suggests that these two outcomes are related to each other. Again, you won't be able to say anything causal. When you move to validations, then you get to well-designed match groups. Of course, you will also still be checking for any potential sources of bias even within a well-matched group, or regression discontinuity design, or randomized control trials, including comparative and multi-level analyses. And then you can begin to say, our implementation caused or is strongly related to outcomes, of course, based on your p-values and a little bit on your power. But here is where you step into the realm of really being able to understand effectiveness. And then finally, when you have multiple validation studies, then you can begin to combine them. Narrative syntheses do this somewhat, but meta-analyses are preferred if you would like to be able to make claims like implementation like these causes outcomes like those. So if you want to be able to say, if I do this, then that will happen, sort of almost regardless of the setting that you're in, the context that you're in, or the students that you have, then you really are looking to very strong causal evidence, and you would be looking to things like meta-analyses. So back to our chart, where we are right now, you can see that I've actually said personalization. We have a lot of existing evidence, both theoretical and empirical, and it sort of goes back to that initial question, how do we define personalization? So if you look at work like James Hattie's work, which are statistical combinations of multiple studies. In his case, it's actually statistical combinations of meta-analyses, so it's a sort of meta-analysis. You can find that elements of personalization or instructional strategies that promote personalized learning do have, what we consider to be above average effects, and they are statistically significant. So that's why I think that in the realm of personalization, in terms of that as an individual piece of blended learning, we have a lot of evidence that supports it. Less so when it comes to competency or learning progressions. Learning for mastery does have a lot of theoretical support and some empirical support, but especially as it's being implemented in schools, we don't have as much data. We have some comparative studies, but not really validations of the extent to which instruction within a mastery-based system or instruction that uses learning progressions is more effective or even as effective as what we consider to be traditional instruction. And then using real-time data to make instructional decisions, we are beginning to have some validation studies, especially from the realm of response to intervention. So if you're looking for that research base, RTI or multi-tiered systems of support, or three-tier models, the different names for basically the same thing. We do have a couple of validation studies that are showing now that using data to drive instruction really is more effective than what we consider to be typical practice. What we really don't have any of right now is a combination of these. So we don't really know if personalization and data use is more effective than traditional instruction, or if there is one of these three pieces that is actually driving effects more than the other two. So, at the end of the day, we might learn that really it's all about using data, and personalization and mastery are secondary sort of drivers of effectiveness to data use. I don't know that will happen, and I'm not theorizing that will be the case, but it's a possible outcome of what we find. We also don't have all of the measurement tools that we need in order to measure outcomes, especially outcomes that are non-academic, and also to measure implementation itself. So we don't really have a good survey or a good tool that is valid and reliable in sort of separating classrooms where blended learning is being implemented as a whole model faithfully and with fidelity, and where it is not. So that's another need in the field, although we do have lots of examples of case studies where researchers have developed rubrics or descriptions of what this could look like in practice. In terms of policies and systemic supports, we actually have no evidence of those, and I don't know that we will, just because of the nature of policy. I don't know that people spend a lot of time studying the effectiveness of policies, but that's something that we need to understand if we're going to understand effectiveness. We have less evidence about more general implementations of blended learning. So if a school self-identifies as being a blended school, we do have some comparative studies, but fewer, and then specific implementations. Going along with that, we have some studies of different content areas in which blended has been studied. And all of those you can find in an edited volume, a very hefty edited volume from the end of 2014 called the Research Handbook on K-12 Online and Blended Learning. That's the best source that I've found so far for understanding, where the evidence is and what studies have been done and where we still need work to be done. And that was courtesy of the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, and Catherine is one of the editors of that volume. So I would strongly encourage, there you go. There's the link, and if you find this to be a helpful document, please do encourage Catherine to produce, follow-ups to it, because of course, it having been published in 2014 means that it only goes up to it only includes research up to 2014. Some of the things we know less about are infrastructure. So school, what are the school level structures that we need in place in terms of even things like what a classroom physically looks like, as well as whether or not there are certain teacher or student subgroups that benefit more or less from blended environments. So, there's a lot still to be learned. TLA expects that we will be able to add some measurement to the existing evidence. Thank you, Michael. And here's where we think we can add evidence. So we will be able to look at classrooms that have different combinations of personalization, competency, and data use. And so we will be able to get data from these classrooms in order to begin to, at the very least, describe examples of what this looks like in practice and talk about the extent to which they are perceived as being effective or not. We hope to also be able to develop or augment some of the measurement tools that are out there, especially the ones that focus on fidelity. And we also expect to support the validation of tools that are looking at non-academic outcomes. So at the student level, we are interested in academic outcomes, emotional outcomes, and then what we're calling cognitive habits and cognitive and behavioral habits of success, because as a cognitive scientist by training, I refuse to use the term non-cognitive skills, but basically these are the non-cognitive skills or social emotional skills that I'm sure many of you have heard of. And then at the teacher level, we are also interested in employee engagement or job satisfaction as a teacher level outcome. So these are, in theory, all of the outcomes that we believe are influenced by or can be impacted by shifting to a blended model. We also expect to do some more work with policies and systemic supports and hope to be able to get to the research level in terms of at least being able to compare policies perhaps at different states or different districts to better understand which policies actually facilitate effective implementation and which ones might hinder it. And then we really expect to have, the biggest influence or the biggest contribution within specific implementations of blended. So for schools that we've identified that are doing 2 or all 3 of, the elements of blended successfully, so that's personalization, competency-based, and real-time use of data, we do want to be able to look within schools and have schools even maybe get to a randomized point, or at least be able to do a very well matched design in order to understand where these practices are effective and where they might be less effective. We have started doing some work on infrastructure and expect through partners like Education Superhighway and others to be able to understand infrastructural needs and effectiveness more closely. And then we have an equity portion of our mission, and so we definitely will also be looking at student and teacher subgroups to better understand if effectiveness is differential across different subgroups. So I described some of these already. I sort of previewed my next slide. One of the things that we've done in the past, so our work on vision for blended, hopefully you can get to that link, but if not, it will be linked from, like I said, the measurement agenda that's online, is to identify classrooms that are implementing aspects of our vision well, and they are perceiving success with it. So one of the things that we're going to release soon is examples or descriptions of what the different elements look like in these different schools. And we don't necessarily think there's going to be one thing that we're saying everyone should do it this way, but we do want to share with others, how some schools are doing it and overcoming challenges. We have also been synthesizing research. So we put out a research clearinghouse also in 2014, I believe, or maybe in early 2015. And so we do continue to look at the research as it's being published and facilitate dissemination. One of the exciting things that is coming up soon is there is very likely to be a special issue for the Journal of Online Learning Research that is dedicated to just this question, right? What does efficacy of blended learning, what do we know? And so that's one of the venues that we think will continue to disseminate findings through. We also support measurement at the state level, like I said, and then we will partner with others to support the development of tools, and we will also be working on developing our own sort of fidelity tools that align with our vision for blended. So where does that leave us? That leaves us with these potential gaps. So the gray bars represent places where there isn't really existing evidence. We don't see TLA specifically contributing to the evidence. And so we are worried, I am worried that these gaps still need to be filled. To hit Susan's question, tools. So in terms of tools, there are multiple different types of tools. If you're thinking about the fidelity type tools or ways of measuring, what blended learning is versus what it isn't, and whether or not it's happening in comparison classrooms as well, because that's something that we think is important in research studies, is not just to document what's happening in your treatment classrooms, but also what's happening in your comparison and the extent to which those are different. We are thinking in terms of observation rubrics, other kinds of checklists, or maybe even just really deep descriptions of what different levels of implementation look like. In terms of outcomes and then potentially impacts, we are also thinking about supporting the development or the validation of existing measures. So right now, especially in the SEL space, in terms of things like grit and mindset, a lot of what exists right now are self-report surveys. But I think both the researchers that work in that field as well as the practitioners that are trying to use these tools, that is an unsatisfying solution. And so I can tell you that there are different types of measures that are being developed that might be based more on things like vignettes and having students rate someone else's behavior on a scale to get a sense of their own level of persistence or grit, as opposed to just asking them, like, how likely are you to finish an assignment when it's due? And we can, yes, Duckworth is the one who's developing the vignettes, and she is working with a consortium. She's working both with Character Lab and with a consortium of California schools to flesh these out some more. I will say that Panorama Education has also put out some open SEL self-report surveys and subscales that have been validated for grades 3 through 5 and 6 through 12. So if you're looking for something right now, those I think are better than nothing, but they still do suffer from that kind of reference bias, which is the problem with self-report scales. So what's the challenge? Like, why isn't this happening? Well, we do know some, as we saw in the previous slide, about effectively personalizing instruction for students. We actually know a lot about that. But the evidence base for blended, so combining it with, using technology as well as using data in real time and moving to a competency or mastery-based progression, all of those things are young. We have a lot of success stories that are being added to the conversation, but they have different levels of evidence, and they're all being described as evidence of success. So if I'm a practitioner and I'm trying to figure out, like, what do we know, what really works, it's hard for me to go through what's out there and be able to determine which studies are more rigorous or less rigorous, which evidence is more applicable to my own students, and which evidence might not be. Implementation is growing rapidly because it has to, right? If you're in an innovative realm, education technology is changing, the workplace is changing, so the world that we are preparing students for is different, and we need to keep up. And teachers have students in front of them today, and they don't have time to wait around for us researchers to take the next 5 to 10 years to figure out, what's really perfectly going to work and what is reducing our risk to as close to zero as possible. So they have to make decisions. And if the evidence doesn't exist, they still have to make a decision. So in this realm, it's useful if researchers take a much more applied view of generating evidence. So, we were trained, I'll speak for myself and many other quantitative methodologists, which I am. We were trained to sort of take the long view, right? Research is almost the opposite of innovation. Research is not about taking risk. It's about taking the long route to understanding, building on theory, testing little things to make sure before you start to test big questions. And so this is one sector in which that view of research is not particularly helpful. And so implementers also need to feel like they have a voice, and they need to be proactive about saying, if they happen to have the ear of a researcher, then they need to say, your hypothesis is great, and it's, it begins a line of work, and I can understand your interest in it, but here's what I really know the answer to. Here's what I really need you to use my data to tell me. And so we also need to temper expectations on both sides so that the evidence actually does match the maturity of implementation. And so you don't have researchers who are feeling pressured to produce evidence that just isn't there yet. And you also don't have implementers or decision makers who are sort of disappointed by what is being found, because this is very new. And so I would be surprised if someone published, a meta-analysis that said, here is the final say that the blended learning is effective. I would be very skeptical of that right now. So I'm thinking that there are really 3 things that we need to do in order to connect evidence generation and implementation. And the 3 things are pretty, I want to say, common sense, but that means that they're also quite easy to do. One of the things that we have to do is just make the research cycle more transparent. So if educators or even other researchers actually know what the hypotheses are that are currently being tested, and if they know what the plans and purposes and goals for measurement are and at different stages, then all of us will be able to more accurately determine, should I make a decision and move on based on whatever the evidence is right now, or should I wait just a little bit because new evidence is on its way that's actually very applicable to the decisions that I have to make. To borrow from another field of study, early reading development, which is where I spent a lot of my time before coming to TLA, this happens at various venues. So sometimes research is shared at conferences, sometimes it's within communities of practice, and sometimes it's within professional development. And part of this is because researchers, I think, are a lot more engaged at the stages like a community of practice or a professional development space, whereas in blended, I think researchers are still primarily presenting at conferences, and researchers and educators aren't really often put into this in the same room. So that's one place where I think there is space for more transparency and better transparency. The other thing that we as researchers can do is to disseminate existing evidence broadly. I know that all of our incentives are really based on publication. And so that sort of leads to an echo chamber. Tom Kane recently did an interview with NPR where he said, there's no FDA for education. And what that leads to is researchers just talk to themselves and the practitioners are sort of left to figure it out on their own. So one of the things that we can do is disseminate negative findings as well. So thinking about new and different venues for just sharing your findings, but both positive and negative findings. Finally, stakeholders can improve communication by making sure that when we speak to each other, we're actually saying the same things. So sometimes we're saying the same words, but we mean different things. And so there is a room for us to really develop a shared language, or at least establish when we begin communicating that we are going to develop a shared language, so that when we as researchers talk about findings, we know that educators are understanding, or practitioners are understanding our intent and not just the words that we're saying. And then finally, from the practitioner side, there's something that practitioners can do too, is really just be more open to being studied. So researchers don't have the evidence. In fact, the evidence and the data exists right now in our classrooms. And so we can't generate new evidence unless we have access to these classrooms. And so sometimes I describe this as sort of a public goods problem, in that a lot of practitioners want the evidence. They want to know what the answer is, but they want someone else to be the guinea pig, right? So they want someone else to offer up their classrooms, their students, and say, yes, you can measure us. But they're not willing to take the plunge until they have the answer. And so it's sort of a catch-22 where, we need to make these studies a safer place. But really, in order to ensure that we can answer the questions that practitioners have. So whether it's through a researcher-practitioner partnership where really the research is answering questions of interest to the practitioners, or whether it's a more traditional type of research study where a school or a district is open to the idea that, we need to find some of the answers to these questions, and so they are willing to, lend their students to us to be able to do that. We definitely need to have a more open view of measurement. So now I'm going to jump into the actual measurement agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about how it's organized, and I am going to focus mostly on the researcher targeted objectives within the agenda, just because we have so many researchers. But I will pause a little bit and talk about the community objectives as well, because we have a couple entrepreneurs or developers, which I'm really glad that we do have that voice being represented today, because I suspect there's more interest in measurement from that area than we tend to think. So basically, the measurement agenda is a series of objectives. You can think of it like a learning agenda, or even maybe like some standards. But there are a series of objectives that are really outlining what are the skills, what's the knowledge, and what are the activities that we need all stakeholders to have in order to build our evidence base and also get evidence and evidence-based practices implemented. Like I said before, they're all focused on teaching and learning. So there's going to be a lot at the classroom and school level. There's less systemic sort of stuff in here. And they're organized into 4 categories. So we have a learning agenda that's focused on knowledge generation. So what are the questions that are still unanswered? What are the new things we need to learn as a field? Dissemination goals. So what do we need to share, and how do we need to share the knowledge that we have generated? Competency standards. So what are the skills that we need to develop? And then finally, implementation objectives. So what do we actually need to do in order to get evidence both generated and then implemented? There is a bit of a cyclical nature to the 4 categories. So, you can think of a particular bit of knowledge traveling all the way through. First it's generated, then it's shared, then the skills that are necessary to implement are acquired, and then finally it's implemented. But there are bits and pieces that already exist in all of the categories. So there is some knowledge that has already been generated and needs to be disseminated. There are some skills that are, already, we know what they are, and they just need to be acquired and applied. So I think of it more like a jigsaw puzzle, a 4-piece jigsaw puzzle. And each of us holds different pieces, but we kind of all need to bring our puzzle pieces to the table if we are to get a whole picture of, what is working and what is going to be best for kids. Within the 4 categories, I've mentioned quite a bit that there are different stakeholders. So we actually have a learning agenda that's developed for each of these 5 groups. researchers, educators, administrators, policymakers, so kind of the decision makers, funders, and then other community members where I do include industry or developers / entrepreneurs. So it really means that there are 20 different pieces to this resource, right? There are 5 different audiences for each of the 4 categories. That makes it sort of unwieldy, and I would love your feedback if you have ideas about how best to organize this. We have ideas, and you know, we're going to post it, in the way that we think is useful. But if you have other ideas that you think would make it easier to consume or easier for folks to find the information that's relevant to them, then please let me know. And then within the required objectives, within the objectives, we have 2 sorts of levels. What's kind of required, what's necessary, what do we have to do in order to understand if blended learning is effective? And then there are the aspirational ones. So like, what is Saro's dream world of education, where, you know, everyone has all of the skills and knowledge that they need, not just to get their job done and not just to best support students, but to be able to really, truly understand effectiveness on many levels. So let's jump right in. As we said before, there are still outstanding questions. The learning agenda focuses on what are the questions still to be answered. And so I'm going to take us to the learning agenda for researchers. What's the overall objective? We want to conduct research that uncovers new knowledge about blended learning effectiveness. How do we need to get there? Well, in this learning agenda, we believe that if researchers take an applied view of research, they're using a research to practice framework for understanding what is and isn't working. They're using different research designs, different measures, and different methods so that we're moving beyond exploratory and descriptive studies, which, you know, we've seen that there are a lot of. And we're moving towards studies that are internally and externally valid and that have designs that can support causal claims. So basically, we're still looking for researchers to generate evidence that is answering some of the questions that are outlined here. Which aspects of implementation are really central to effectiveness? And that includes validating competency or mastery-based or learning progressions. We still need to know, like, under which conditions is implementation most or least likely to be effective. And by conditions, I mean, are there certain content areas? Are there certain models of blended? You know, sort of what are the more contextual factors that are either helping or hindering implementation effectiveness? For which students and for which educators is implementation more or least likely to be effective? And then under which circumstances? And by circumstances, I mean more systemic institutional type structures. So conditions I think of as being within classroom factors, and then circumstances I think of being as, you know, outside external factors to the classroom, but are still, you know, strongly influencing what is happening in a classroom. And then finally, we need to know, like, to what extent do we mean the same things when we use the same terms? And I'm not of the belief that we all have to agree. So I don't think that there's one definition of personalized learning that everybody needs to be into. But I do think that we need to be very explicit and clear when we are talking about things like blended or when we are using terms so that other people can understand what we mean, and then they can take away from it whether or not it's applicable to their own situation. And then finally, other questions that are likely to arise and that are identified from practice. So questions that decision makers and implementers are identifying as being crucial to practice. And then my pie in the sky sort of what would be the goal, or what would be the ideal, is that researchers would generate evidence that answers the question, to what extent is there a single vision for effective blended learning? And the answer might be to no extent, right? Like, it has to be unique for everyone, for every school, for every classroom, but we don't know. And that's still an empirical question. For community members and industry, what we really hope is that they are supporting the research that uncovers new knowledge about blended learning effectiveness, and specific to industry, for their own products, right? So if you have developed a product, or if you are producing a product, then our hope is that you are supporting research that is helping us understand your product's effectiveness within a blended model. So what we would love is for community members and other stakeholders to take a data-driven approach to understanding what's working, that they look to different research designs, measures, and methods to increase their level of confidence in findings, to be able to understand more sophisticated implications of cause and effect, and also to generate findings that are applicable to broader classrooms and contexts. So basically, we would love for all community members, including industry, to be more sophisticated generators and consumers of evidence, so that when new evidence is being generated, then they're asking the right questions. So the questions that we would like them to ask, or that we think are actually most relevant to them, would be questions about conditions. So like I said, within classroom conditions, students, educators, and circumstances. So we don't think community members are necessarily going to benefit from understanding the nuts and bolts, right, of implementation. So personalization versus competency-based, maybe not so much, but they definitely will benefit from understanding their own, the extent to which the evidence supports this as a model for their own students or educators, as well as their own conditions and circumstances. So hopefully you get a sense of how this resource is organized. So within the learning agenda, we've identified the objectives, and in this one, it's the research questions that are applicable to each different audience. So the educators one is slightly different from the researchers one. Moving on, so for the dissemination goals, this is going to be arranged in the same way as the learning agenda, so by audience, but these objectives are actually focused much more on what needs to be shared and how do we need to share it. So for researchers, we think that the objective here is to disseminate the foundational knowledge required to implement, and then also knowledge required to measure blended learning. So we want researchers to be sharing findings and implications, maybe even recommendations, in ways that allow non-researchers to be able to access and interpret this evidence, and also to be able to share, and so focused on what's the state of evidence. So what do we know? What are the activities that are required for implementation? So are there student-focused activities, teacher-focused activities, data, and also infrastructural activities that we really need to tell practitioners about, right, in order for them to implement? What are the potential academic and non-academic outcomes and impacts of implementation? So if I'm a practitioner, what is it reasonable for me to expect, right, to change if I decide to shift to a blended model? And same for teachers. And then aspirationally, right, in a perfect world, researchers would also support the use of evidence-based blended practices by sharing with practitioners what's the difference between research and evaluation and other types of measurement? What is the role of these different varying types of measurement, and then how should they measure implementation at different stages? So again, this is, in Saro's ideal world, researchers would be sharing all of this knowledge with practitioners so that both the implementation and the measurement of blended in classrooms would increase, and we would be doing what we know to be effective. For community members and industry, the dissemination goals are actually very similar. They're almost exactly the same. So basically, we want community members to be aware of the current state of evidence and the potential academic, non-academic, student, and teacher outcomes. We want them to understand, first of all, what do we know? And second of all, what difference might this make for their constituents, both students and teachers? And then finally, it would be great if they understood what is required for implementation and how to measure implementation at different stages, so that in their own implementation, they can actually take more of a data-driven approach, and they can continue to understand, is it still working, or do things need to be changed on an ongoing basis? So it's not just a one-time thing. For the competency standards, these are really what are the skills that we think people need to acquire. And so we think researchers need to be able to facilitate application. They need to be able to help others apply knowledge about and resources about blended, both in implementation and measurement. So Overall, we want researchers to be able to support implementers in aligning measurement questions and measurement activities with their objectives for implementation. We want them to be able to identify and use, to help others identify and use relevant existing data to measure the implementation, sorry. We want them to look at comparison groups to contextualize results, and then understand how to select valid and reliable measures. So again, these are not skills that we think researchers don't have. These are actually skills that I am confident researchers already have, but researchers don't have the skill of facilitating others or helping others in doing this. So that's where we think there is a gap right now. And in terms of community members and industry, again, we want the skill that we want them to have is to be able to apply other people's findings to their own communities, to be able to understand and identify appropriate objectives for implementation. So really thinking about what is an appropriate goal, what is a problem that we can reasonably expect Blended to help us solve, so that we don't begin to see it as a panacea, or we're not in a context where everyone thinks that we're just doing this because for some strange reason we should, or we think we have to, right? Like we truly understand what we expect to get at the other end. And then we can make good decisions about whether or not this is a relevant and effective solution for the problems that we have. And then aspirationally, again, this idea of ongoing measurement and an ongoing data-driven approach. In an ideal world, community members and industry will be able to ensure that the measurement activities that require data collection are aligned with their objectives. They would allow the identification and the use of existing data. They would allow, or they would actually demand, that comparison groups are identified and used to contextualize results, and then they would facilitate the use of valid and reliable measures. So one of the ways that community members actually have a large role to play in measurement activities is that oftentimes they are the gatekeepers for measurement, right? So oftentimes it's a parent consent form that actually decides whether or not a student can participate in a study. And so if we have communities that are much more knowledgeable about measurement and the potential benefits and the potential outcomes, but also the resources that are required, right? Like what makes a good study, and so what makes a finding really useful to us as a community, if they're aware of all of those things, then they can help facilitate better measurement. And finally, the objectives for implementation. So what do we actually need to do? Well, as researchers, we want to conduct appropriately rigorous and relevant studies that uncover new knowledge, but also knowledge that is applicable to practice. We want to obviously be addressing gaps in existing knowledge, but we also want to focus on the instructional practices that are occurring. So shifting our thinking of blended learning away from it as a treatment in and of itself, or like an intact intervention, but actually thinking about what are the practices that go into making it different from what we did before. And then finally, that middle one there, we as researchers do need to create measures of new constructs or validate existing measures for new uses. I know there's been a lot of debate recently about whether or not the SEL constructs have sort of gotten ahead of us, and states and other entities are now requiring measures of those constructs to be included in teacher evaluations, for example. And there's a lot of discourse about whether or not the construct is actually there yet. And I think we as researchers need to acknowledge, if this is a need in the field, then we need to step up and address that need. It's one thing to say, please don't use my measure inappropriately, but it's quite another thing to say, and by the way, there is no measure that you can use to do this. So folks like Angela Duckworth, who was mentioned before, and many others are actually working on addressing this problem. And then finally, for community members and industry, in terms of what we would like for them to do, we think that they need to seek appropriately rigorous and relevant measurement to uncover new knowledge. So basically, again, focusing on the instructional practices, both of their own products, but also in general, that are that are either occurring or being scaled or sustained as part of implementation. So it's not just about the technology, but it's about really understanding what can the technology facilitate and what do we know about good instructional practice. So I know I kind of flew through those, but I was mindful of the time. I did want to open it up for questions at this point. I see there's a couple of folks typing. Okay, while people are typing, okay, there is a question. Okay, so the question basically is how much does this apply to education broadly or other fields within education, and how much is specific to blended? I think the crucial part that is very specific to blended or educational technology, or maybe even personalized learning, if you are defining personalized learning as including education technology, is the fact that our existing research cycles are no longer fast enough to keep up with the innovation. So in STEM education or special education, we sort of had the luxury of time because the actual instructional interventions were not growing and changing as quickly as they do within a blended or an ed tech setting. So both the measurement, I think, needs to happen faster as well as the dissemination. But I also think new questions from practice are also being generated more quickly just because of the innovation cycle is so much quicker. Thank you. Excellent, Michael. I'm glad you found this helpful. So thank you, Catherine. Where people can find this resource. So the Learning Accelerator website is www.learningaccelerator.org. And from there, we have two links to resources and recommendations. One is for districts and one is for states. You will be able to find the measurement agenda within the measurement section of the resources and recommendations for districts. So that's a long way of saying it will be linked from our website, but I also will arrange to have it posted with the recording of this webinar. So if it's easier for you to just come back here and look for a link there, we will also make sure that the link is there. How best can people get involved in helping me? So my email address, saro.mohammed@learningaccelerator.org, is also all over our website. And I'm pretty sure that, Justin and Catherine will be able to link it from this webinar recording as well. But literally send me an email if you're interested or if you're working on something that you think is related, or if you just want to chat. I do a lot of 1-hour phone calls with districts, especially who are just beginning to embark either on implementation or measurement, and they just want to talk through how to think about measurement. I'm happy to do that as well. So email is probably the best way to get involved. Thank you. All right, we're just at time, so I'm going to turn it back over to Justin at this point.
Thank you so much, Saro. That was incredibly informative, applicable, really exciting to see the work being done around measuring blended learning. So hopefully folks can find a lot of application in the work that you all are doing, and hopefully we've established some good connections here to collaborate further on further research and further work. I did just want to open up a couple polls to end our session today, basically for our own purposes, to make sure that we have our fulfilling our promise of making these webinars both satisfactory and valuable. So I'll open those up, and hopefully folks can go ahead and vote in them. And then while we go ahead and wrap up, I'll just mention a few of our own initiatives here out of the Institute. We want to make mention of our Virtual Viewpoints podcast, where we chat with researchers, practitioners, policymakers, anyone along the spectrum of education who are doing some work in the area of virtual learning or blended learning and how they're incorporating research in their work as well. And then another initiative of ours is our guest blogger program. So we have a nice little blog platform where folks can come share some of their own original research or some stories of how they're applying research in their own work. If you're interested in writing for us, be sure to click that link. We do host bloggers from all around the country doing all sorts of exciting work in blended online learning. And if you're interested in being a guest in our podcast, maybe you've gotten a chance to listen to our podcast in the past, you'd like to come and share some of your own stories, please just reach out to me directly. I will put my email in the chat as well, and we would be happy to set up a time to chat and record our conversation and share it with our audience. Also want to make mention of our next upcoming webinar next Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. We will be hosting a group of researchers from Old Dominion University who will be talking about a recently published article, some of their research around online tutoring programs for middle school math students. So you can actually read the session description by visiting our webinars page there at mvlri.org/presentations/webinars. And again, a multitude of other ways that you can stay in contact with us or follow our work. Be sure to email us, drop us a line if you have any questions about anything at mvlri@mivu.org. You can sign up for our mailing list by clicking that link there. You can also find that sign up link on our website at mvlri.org. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. All of our handles and our links are listed there as well. Our YouTube channel, where we do host the recordings of all of our previous webinars and where you can expect the recording of this webinar to be posted within the next day or two. You can find it at MVLRI1, which is our YouTube handle. And again, our webinars page at mvlri.org/presentations/webinars. You can see our upcoming webinars as well as all of our archived webinars where we link to the recordings as well. We hope everyone enjoys the rest of your Wednesday, the rest of your week. We want to again thank Saro for joining us and presenting for us today. With that, take care, everyone. Thanks again, Saro.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yep, I will shoot you the link to the recording as soon as we've got it pulled down.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks so much.
All right, see ya. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.